Welcome everyone to this week's lecture on Latinx places. And as we saw in the reading, there are different ways of talking about places for Latinxes in the United States. There could be barrios, neighborhoods that are created by Latinx populations in the United States. There's also the question of home and how this experience in the United States impacts how Latinxes create a sense of home for themselves. There is also the question of housing itself and discrimination in renting and purchasing housing, and also at a metaphorical level, thinking about what borderlands means and what a borderlands experience is for Latinxes. So first, we begin by talking about barrios, actual physical spaces where people have lived. Barrios refers to neighborhoods or communities where dense enclaves of Latinx populations have settled, and you find these throughout the United States in different cities and so on. These have often been created historically out of a need for affordable housing and have been a result of segregation and housing discrimination. So these neighborhoods have been created out of a necessity. They've also become spaces that affirm cultural identity, provide a space of belonging for displaced people, and create a sense of cultural solidarity. In more recent years, we have also seen how many of these neighborhoods have become threatened by gentrification and urban planning. The reading also talks about housing and what housing means for the Latinx population. And you can see that captured in this quote: "A shelter is deemed to provide more than a place for lodging and dwelling. It provides security, safety, dignity, supports identity, and is a place for belonging, a home, a casa, and an hogar." So you can see there are multiple layers of meaning for what having adequate housing is like for the Latinx population. It's not just about having a place to live, but is about creating a particular kind of space for yourself and your family. Now, this kind of actual physical housing, however, has been navigated through the experience of discrimination from the Latinx population, from having government housing agencies discriminating against providing affordable housing, mortgage loans, and other housing benefits to Latinx groups. The practice of redlining, which deems certain neighborhoods as undesirable by realtors, which brings down the value of the properties in those particular neighborhoods. There's also been stories of discrimination by white landlords, which have prevented Latinxes from certain rental housing. There's multiple anecdotal stories of people who have shown up to see an apartment, answering an ad for a rental. And once they show up, they're told that the apartment has already been rented. And it's because the landlord realizes that the person interested is someone who is Latinx. There's also the bigger repercussions of housing discrimination, which results in health inequalities, wealth gap, and access to education. If you're living in certain kinds of neighborhoods that have been deemed undesirable, that are not considered places that you want to take care of, especially by city officials, then these are the kinds of spaces where you have more incidences of health issues, inability or inaccessibility to health clinics and so on. A wealth gap is created, particularly when redlining deems certain neighborhoods less desirable, which even if people own their homes in those neighborhoods, the value of their homes was considerably less than the value of similar houses in other types of neighborhood. And also access to education. A lot of these neighborhoods are segregated, and therefore the schools that are in these neighborhoods tend to be the most under-resourced schools, and therefore the kind of education that the children in that kind of neighborhood have is less than the kind of education that their counterparts experience in other kinds of more affluent neighborhoods. Now, there were a number of examples given in the reading of how people have fought and won or fought and lost in terms of upholding or holding on to their particular neighborhoods. We saw through the article that was assigned for this week the case of the Barrio Chavez Ravine, which was one of the oldest Mexican-American neighborhoods in Los Angeles. And in the 1950s, the city forcefully evicted 300 families that lived in this neighborhood. The land was cleared under eminent domain, which permits the government to purchase property from private individuals in order to build projects for the public good. And in this case, the project was supposed to be public housing, but the public housing project ends up being scrapped, and instead the neighborhood ends up being sold, or the land ends up being sold to build the new stadium for the Dodgers. And so you'll see in the article, as well as in one of the videos that I'm providing, sort of the history of this neighborhood, what happened, but also sort of the long-term impacts of this experience for the people who were living in that community. Part of what the reading talks about is sort of the involvement of women in this fight. And particularly, again, this is the 1950s, this is after World War II. These are neighborhoods where husbands and sons had served in the war. And so this was sort of the context in which many of these women were making their arguments as to why it was unfair for them to be told that they needed to leave their homes. So women argued for their rights to a home as mothers and wives of soldiers. They made patriotic arguments for their right to a home, many arguing that, again, because of the sacrifices that the families made for the nation, fighting for the United States in the war, that they deserved and had a right to their homes. They also used citizenship to argue for a right to their home. Again, they, particularly Mexican Americans who were American citizens, again, made the argument about, as citizens, having a right to their homes, to the homes that they owned and that they built themselves. They argued in favor of funds being invested in the neighborhood instead of on public housing. One of the arguments when targeting a particular neighborhood on the basis of eminent domain and pushing people out is that these neighborhoods are blighted, that they are basically neighborhoods that need to be developed, right? That they're not productive neighborhoods. And so their argument was that instead of getting rid of the entire neighborhood and putting up huge public housing buildings and basically destroying a community, to instead use those funds to invest in the neighborhood, right? Help them make their homes better, be able to develop and pave their streets, get lights up on the streets and so on. And when you see the video, you will get a visual of what this neighborhood looked like. There were dirt roads and really sort of isolated away from the rest of the city. And so part of what they did is to, again, point out the negligence by the city in maintaining their neighborhood. And, you know, their argument was that if the city took a more active role in maintaining the neighborhood wouldn't be blighted. They also made the argument that public housing were turning homeowners into renters. Part of what the promise they were given was that if they sold their houses to the city, they would be the first ones to be able to have access to the public housing that was going to be rebuilt. But these were a promise that they weren't going to be able to own. They were only going to be rental units. And so the argument was that they were being forced to turn from owning homes to becoming renters. Some of the other issues related to this incident was that the houses were purchased by the city at quote unquote market value, which was less than the amount needed to purchase new homes. So even though they were being told, well, this is the value of your home and that's what we're giving you, that amount of money was not sufficient for them to be able to afford to purchase a home in any other neighborhood in the city. There was also discovered that the amount offered by the city for their homes was less than what the amount, the actual value of their houses when they were appraised. There were also concerns by members of this community to move into other non-Latino neighborhoods based on discriminatory experiences that some of their previous neighbors who had attempted to leave the neighborhood ended up returning and telling stories of how unhappy they were and the kind of hostility they experienced outside the neighborhood. Many of the owners were also elderly and and being displaced from the only homes they'd ever known. These were the homes where they had raised their children, their grandchildren, and now they were in their 60s and being told that they needed to move. One of their later arguments was that the reason they had been displaced from their neighborhoods was for this public housing project. And once it was rejected, they still had lost their homes, they had lost their land. And this allowed them, the city, to purchase the land cheap and resell it for a very cheap price to the Brooklyn Dodgers to be able to create their new stadium in Los Angeles. Counter to that experience, the reading also mentions the organizing by neighbors in what is called Villa Victoria neighborhood in Boston, Massachusetts, where here we see a different experience where this parcel 19, had been slated for demolition for same kinds of arguments that this was a blighted community that they could demolish and put in better development. In this case, the residents organized, just like the residents in Chavez Ravine did. This took place in the 1960s to stop the destruction of their neighborhood. And they do this by creating the organization Inquilinos Boricuas en Acción in 1968. This was a primarily Puerto Rican neighborhood. And what ends up happening in this particular case is that they actually become invited into the development plan for the area. And so what they end up creating is the Villa Victoria Village, Victory Village, a 435-unit affordable housing community in the city's South End neighborhood, which has become a model in the areas of civil rights, community organizing, affordable housing, education, and arts program. Today, the organization has expanded its affordable housing portfolio to include 521 units that are strengthened by comprehensive programming. IBA's work is a daily reminder of what can be achieved with effort, determination, and community organizing. And so part of what they included and developed into this neighborhood was a community center, arts projects for the children, a park, and so on. So it really sort of demonstrated what is possible if you include members of the neighborhood into your urban development plans, where you can create something new for the members of the community, while at the same time meeting the goals of developing older, more dilapidated neighborhoods without displacing people. So this is an interesting, different result that you have in contrast to what happened in Chavez Ravine. Now, you may or may not be familiar that our campus is actually a result of a similar kind of incident, where the Auraria campus sits where the Auraria neighborhood used to be, which was a majority Mexican-American neighborhood in Denver. In 1965, there is a significant flood that leads the neighborhood being targeted as a blighted community and targeted for urban renewal. So after the flood, it was sort of determined that by the city that in the area was, in a sense, not worth saving as a neighborhood and should be targeted for development. The neighbors were displaced similar to the case of Chavez Ravine, where they received letters being told that they needed to move and leave their homes. And again, we're sort of, exchange the cost of their house and supposedly be able to use those funds to move elsewhere. Here, the other interesting situation is that they're not being told that their homes are going to be replaced with other kind of housing, as we saw in the Villa Victoria or the Chavez Ravine case. Here, they were essentially displaced in order to create the three-institution campus that we see today, which ends up being completed in 1976. There in the image, what you see still standing after they razed the rest of the neighborhood is St. Cajetan's. As further sort of payment, displaced people were offered scholarships for their children to attend the institutions at the New Aurora campus. But this promise, even though this all happened in the late 60s and the 70s, that promise was not fulfilled until 1994. And recently it has been expanded for all descendants of people who live or lived in the Aurora neighborhood. And so you can see sort of elements of what the neighborhood must look like. If you go to 9th Street area on campus, there's still homes that existed from that time period that were saved and upheld, which currently serve as offices for the different institutions on campus. So this is an issue that comes close to home for us as being a part of the university community, walking around the neighborhood, the campus, which used to be people's homes, people's neighborhood. So being able to be mindful of that history. One of the other concepts in relationship to place that the reading talked about was this idea of borderlands, referring both to an actual space of the border between Mexico and the United States, sort of that area close to the border, and what it's like to be in that space for people who live there that are firsthand experiencing what it's like to sort of be in this in-between space between both countries. Metaphorically, it also refers to the Latinx cultural and identity experience of being in between two cultures. The reading also talked about the borderlands as a militarized space where people experience policing and violence, not just those that are crossing the border, but also people who live along the border. The reading also talked about how in recent years in studies in Latino studies, the meaning of the borderlands has been expanded to include the borders of Central America, as we have more and more people coming from Central America. They're crossing multiple borders to get to the United States. The border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic is another sort of border space that gets studied, as that space has its own particular history and has also defined relationships between Haiti and the Dominican Republic that carry over when people from both Haiti and the Dominican Republic end up as immigrants in the United States. And more recently, we've seen the ocean itself being discussed as a quote-unquote liquid border crossing space for people from the Caribbean, particularly Cuban immigrants who if you've seen any headlines over the years about Cuban immigration, a lot of that immigration has taken place by crossing the ocean from Cuba to Florida in particular. And the difficulties, the perils, the dangers of crossing that particular border being similar in many ways to the dangers of crossing the US-Mexico border. So this here ends the lecture for this week. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on the discussion post. Have a good week.